The fog wrapped Vaeloria's cobblestone streets like a living shroud, muffling the clatter of hooves and the groan of cartwheels, as if the town itself sought to silence its own existence. Nestled in a forgotten corner of Europe, Vaeloria was a labyrinth of steep gables, shadowed alleys, and secrets carved into the stones, each one older and darker than the last. No one could pinpoint its founding. Its history was a mosaic of whispered tales, passed down in trembling voices by firelight, each story a thread in a tapestry of dread. The air carried a bone-deep chill, as if the earth exhaled fear, and the townsfolk moved with a wariness that spoke of truths they dared not name, their eyes always glancing over their shoulders, searching for something they couldn't see. Clara Varnholt stood at the edge of the town square, her gray eyes slicing through the mist like a blade. At 30, she was a wanderer, driven by a relentless hunger to unravel mysteries others fled, her life a series of questions without answers. Her coat was threadbare, patched at the elbows from years of wear, her boots scuffed from weeks of travel across muddy roads and forgotten paths. She had come to Vaeloria chasing rumors, tales of vanishings without trace, of doors that opened to nowhere, of shadows that moved without a source, their forms flickering in the corners of terrified eyes. At the inn the previous night, an old woman had clutched a rosary, her fingers trembling as she muttered, "Demons don't need doors." Clara had dismissed it as superstition, but the words burrowed into her mind, heavy as the fog, sharp as a splinter under her skin. Beside her stood Elias Thorne, a wiry folklorist with a scholar's stoop and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles, their lenses smudged from constant handling. His leather-bound journal, filled with cramped notes on local legends, was tucked under his arm, its pages worn from months of obsessive study. They had met by chance in a neighboring city, drawn together by shared skepticism and a compulsion to chase the unknown, their conversations late into the night forging an uneasy alliance. "This place feels wrong," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the fog might overhear and take offense. "It's like the air is watching." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the church that dominated the square, its presence both sentinel and threat. Its spire pierced the mist, a black silhouette against a bruised sky, its stones weathered but unyielding, as if they had stood since the world was young. The townsfolk avoided it, their eyes darting away when it was mentioned, their steps quickening as they passed, as if proximity alone could pull them into its shadows. "That's where we start," Clara said, her tone resolute, though a flicker of unease stirred in her chest, a warning she ignored. "The answers are in there. I can feel it." Elias hesitated, his fingers twitching toward his journal, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "The locals say no one's been inside for years. Not since the last priest vanished. They say he went in at midnight, muttering about voices, and never came out. His screams echoed till dawn." "Then we'll be the first," Clara replied, striding forward, her boots clicking on the cobblestones, each step a defiance of the fear coiling in her gut. Elias followed, his reluctance a tangible weight, his breath visible in the chill air, his journal clutched like a talisman. The church doors were heavy oak, carved with faded symbols, perhaps protective runes, eroded by centuries of wind and rain, their shapes barely discernible but pulsing with a faint, unnatural light. They groaned as Clara pushed them open, the sound echoing into a cavernous interior, a hollow cry that seemed to rouse something in the dark. Dust motes danced in slivers of light piercing grimy stained glass windows, their colors dulled to sickly hues of red and green, casting shadows that seemed to writhe. The air was thick with the scent of old wax, mildew, and something sharper, like iron or blood, a metallic tang that clung to the back of Clara's throat. Pews stood in silent rows, their wood warped and splintered, some bearing scratches that looked too deliberate, too precise, to be accidental, as if claws had marked them in the night. At the far end, an altar loomed, draped in a cloth that had once been white but was now stained a sickly yellow, as if the stone beneath had bled through, its edges frayed like a wound. "Charming," Elias muttered, his voice echoing faintly in the vast space, his words swallowed by the silence that followed. He clutched his journal like a shield, his knuckles white, his eyes darting to every shadow. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Anything," Clara said, her eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to shift just beyond her vision, their movements too quick to follow, too subtle to be sure. "A clue, a sign. Something to explain why this town feels like it's holding its breath." They moved deeper, their footsteps unnervingly loud, each step stirring dust that hung in the air like a warning, a reminder that they were intruders in a place that wanted them gone. Clara's hand brushed a pew, and she froze, her breath catching. The wood was warm, as if touched by something living moments before, its heat lingering like a pulse, a heartbeat that shouldn't be. She glanced at Elias, who hadn't noticed, his attention fixed on a cracked statue of an angel in the corner, its wings chipped, its face wrong, too smooth, too human, its eyes hollow pits that seemed to follow them, unblinking and cold, their gaze a weight on her soul. "Clara," Elias whispered, his voice tight, his spectacles slipping further down his nose. "Do you hear that?" She strained her ears, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, there was only the distant drip of water, echoing from some unseen leak, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock her pulse. Then, faintly, a sound, a low hum, like a chant, rising and falling in a rhythm that made her skin crawl, its cadence unnatural, its tone scraping against her mind like nails on stone. It seemed to come from beneath the floor, from the walls, from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices that weren't human, their words unintelligible but heavy with intent. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though her voice lacked conviction, her hand tightening on the knife at her belt, its weight a small comfort against the growing dread. She stepped toward the altar, her fingers brushing the stained cloth, its texture rough and damp, as if it had absorbed the church's secrets. As her fingers grazed it, the humming stopped, the silence sudden and suffocating, like the moment before a scream, the air thick with expectation. Elias grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "Don't," he hissed, his voice trembling, his face pale. "Something's not right." She shook him off, her curiosity outweighing the fear clawing at her chest, her need for answers stronger than the instinct to run. "We didn't come here to turn back." She pulled the cloth away, the fabric tearing slightly, revealing a stone slab etched with symbols that pulsed faintly, as if lit from within, their light a sickly green that made her stomach turn, their shapes twisting in ways that defied geometry. At the slab's center was a handprint, scorched into the stone, its edges blackened and cracked, as if burned by something hotter than fire, its presence a wound in the altar's surface. Before either could speak, the church doors slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, the sound of thunderclap that echoed in the stillness, dust raining from the rafters like ash. Clara spun around, her heart pounding, her knife now in hand, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. The windows had darkened, the fog outside pressing against the glass like a living thing, its tendrils curling against the panes, seeking entry. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, darting just beyond her grasp, their movements too quick, too deliberate, to be tricks of the light. "Clara," Elias said, his voice trembling, his journal clutched to his chest, his spectacles fogging with sweat. "We need to leave. Now." She threw her weight against the doors, her palms stinging from the impact, the wood cold now, unnaturally so, its surface slick as if coated in ice. The symbols carved into it seemed to writhe under her touch, their shapes twisting like living things, their light pulsing in time with the humming that had returned, louder now, a chorus of voices that scraped against her mind. "It's not locked," she said, her voice rising, edged with a panic she refused to acknowledge. "It's holding us." Elias backed away, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short gasps, his journal slipping from his grasp. This was a mistake. The stories, they weren't just stories. The humming grew louder, a cacophony of voices that weren't human, their words a tangle of syllables that clawed at her thoughts, each one a needle in her skull. The shadows thickened, coalescing into shapes, almost human but wrong, too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets cut from their strings. One stepped forward, its face a featureless void except for a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with needle-like teeth that gleamed in the dim light, their edges sharp enough to cut the air. "Clara Varnholt," it said, its voice a rasp that echoed inside her skull, as if it spoke from within her, its words a violation of her mind. "You seek what should not be sought." Clara stumbled back, her knife raised, though it felt useless, a child's toy against the thing before her, its presence a weight that pressed against her soul. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest, her heart a drumbeat in her ears, her scar from a childhood accident burning as if it remembered something she didn't. The thing tilted its head, as if amused, its mouth stretching wider, a grotesque parody of a smile. "We are what was before. We are what waits. Doors mean nothing to us." Elias was muttering under his breath, prayers or curses, Clara couldn't tell, his words a frantic jumble, his hands fumbling to retrieve his journal. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the altar, her mind racing for a plan, any plan, to escape the nightmare closing in. "We need to find a way out," she said, her eyes locked on the symbols glowing brighter now, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls like specters, their movements mocking her desperation. The creature moved closer, its steps silent but deliberate, its form flickering like smoke caught in a draft, its claws twitching as if eager to tear. Others emerged from the darkness, their shapes shifting and reforming, their eyes, if they had eyes, glowing with a malice that made the air feel heavier, their presence a pressure on her mind, her soul. "You cannot leave," the first one said, its voice now a chorus of whispers, each one slicing into her thoughts like a blade. "You opened the way." "I didn't open anything." Clara snapped, her knife trembling in her grip, her defiance a thin shield against the growing dread, her voice echoing in the empty church. She glanced at Elias, who was flipping through his journal with shaking hands, his spectacles fogging with sweat, his eyes wide with panic. "The symbols," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the humming, his fingers smudging the ink as he turned the pages. "They're old, older than the church. They're a seal, Clara. A binding." "Then how do we unbind it?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the advancing creature, its claws now inches from her face, its mouth gaping wider, its teeth gleaming like shards of glass. "I don't know." Elias cried, his voice cracking, his journal nearly slipping from his grasp. "The texts don't say." His words were cut off by a scream, not his, not hers, but something else, something that came from the walls themselves, a wail that shook the church, sending dust cascading from the rafters like a storm of ash. The creatures paused, their heads tilting as if listening to a command only they could hear, their forms flickering like candles in a draft. Then, as one, they turned toward the altar, their movements synchronized, their shapes rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Clara seized the moment, dragging Elias toward a side door she hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a rotting tapestry depicting a forgotten saint, its threads frayed, its colors bled to gray. The door was small, unmarked, its wood splintered but intact, its surface cold as death. She shoved it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness, the air wafting up cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and something fouler, like decay laced with sulfur, a smell that made her stomach churn. "We can't go down there," Elias protested, his face pale, his spectacles slipping further down his nose, his journal clutched to his chest like a lifeline. "It's a trap." "We don't have a choice," Clara said, pushing him forward, her voice sharp with urgency, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The creatures were moving again, their forms dissolving into shadow and reforming closer with each step, their claws scraping the air, their mouths whispering her name. She slammed the door shut behind them, the sound echoing in the tight space, though she knew it wouldn't hold, the wood already creaking under an unseen pressure. The staircase seemed endless, its walls slick with moisture, etched with more of those strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark, their light pulsing like a heartbeat, their shapes twisting in ways that made her eyes ache. The humming followed, now a cacophony that made Clara's head throb, each note a needle in her skull, each syllable a weight on her soul. Elias stumbled, clutching his journal, his breath ragged, his spectacles fogging with the damp air. "This is a crypt," he whispered, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with fear. "We're walking into a tomb. Then we'd better find a way out before we're buried in it," Clara said, her voice grim, her hand steady on her knife, though its blade felt useless against the darkness closing in. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of decay stronger, and the symbols seemed to watch them, their shapes shifting in her peripheral vision, their light flickering like eyes in the dark. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with stone sarcophagi, their lids carved with faces, human but distorted, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow and accusing, their expressions frozen in terror. At the chamber's center stood a circular platform, its surface a mosaic of black and red tiles forming a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward, toward a void that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The symbols from the altar were here, too, glowing with that same sickly light, their pulses synchronized with the humming that filled the air, a rhythm that matched the pounding of Clara's heart. "Clara," Elias said, his voice barely audible, his face pale as the stone around them, his spectacles crooked on his nose. "This isn't a crypt. It's a temple." The air shimmered, and the creatures appeared, not through the door, but from the walls themselves, their forms bleeding through the stone like ink through paper, their shapes more defined now, their claws longer, their mouths wider, their eyes, if they had eyes, burning with a hunger that chilled her blood. The lead creature spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers that clawed at Clara's mind, each word a blade that cut deeper than her knife ever could. "You cannot run. The seal is breaking." Clara's mind raced, her heart pounding, her scar burning as if it recognized the place, the creatures, the symbols. Elias had said the symbols were a seal, a binding. If it was breaking, these things, the first ones, as she begun to think of them, were about to be unleashed, not just on Vaeloria but beyond, a thought that tightened her throat, made her breath catch. She turned to Elias, her voice urgent, her eyes locked on his. "Your journal, does it say anything about resealing it?" Elias fumbled with the pages, his hands trembling, his spectacles fogging again, his fingers smudging the ink as he searched. "There's a ritual, but it's incomplete," he said, his voice shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "It needs blood, a sacrifice." Clara's stomach twisted, her grip on the knife tightening, the blade biting into her palm. "How much blood?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. He didn't answer, but his eyes, wide and haunted, told her everything. She cursed under her breath, her gaze darting to the creatures circling the platform, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators savoring the hunt, their claws twitching, their mouths gaping, their presence a weight that pressed against her mind, her soul, whispering things she couldn't quite hear but felt in her bones. "We don't have time for this," she said, stepping onto the platform, her boots echoing on the mosaic, the tiles pulsing under her feet, the symbols flaring brighter, their light burning her eyes, searing her skin. "Tell me what to do." Elias began reading from his journal, his voice shaking but clear, each word a struggle against the humming that threatened to drown him out, the creature's whispers that clawed at his mind. "Place your hand on the center. Speak the words, ego te lego, umbra aeterna. It means, I bind you, eternal shadow." Clara knelt, pressing her palm against the cold stone at the mosaic center, the surface burning her skin, the pain sharp and immediate, a fire that spread through her veins. She gritted her teeth, her voice steady despite the agony, and spoke, the words heavy on her tongue. "Ego te lego, umbra aeterna." The chamber shook, the sarcophagi rattling as if something inside was trying to escape, their carved faces seeming to twist in agony, their eyes glowing with a light that wasn't their own. The creatures shrieked, their forms flickering, their claws slashing the air inches from Clara's face, their mouths gaping wider, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed like obsidian, sharp enough to cut through bone. She repeated the words, her voice hoarse, blood trickling from her palm where the stone had burned her, the red mixing with the mosaic's tiles, the light intensifying until it was blinding, a sickly green that pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a rhythm that threatened to consume her. Something pulled at her, not just her body, but her mind, her memories, her very self, a force that tore at the edges of who she was. She saw flashes, faces she didn't know, places she'd never been, all tinged with despair, their edges fraying like old cloth. A child's laughter turned to screams, a village consumed by shadow, a hand reaching for her from the dark, its fingers cold and endless. She shook her head, forcing the visions back, her voice rising, defiant against the chaos. "Ego te lego, umbra aeterna." "Clara." Elias's voice cut through the haze, sharp and desperate, his hand on her shoulder, his own face pale, his eyes wide with fear but resolute. "You're doing it. Don't stop." The creatures were closer, their forms more solid, their mouths gaping, their claws grazing Elias's arm, tearing through his coat, blood soaking his sleeve, a red stain that spread like ink. He cried out, a sharp gasp, but didn't pull away, his hand steady on her shoulder, his voice joining hers. "Keep going," he gasped, his voice thick with pain, his spectacles crooked, his eyes burning with a determination that matched her own. "It's working." Clara's vision blurred, her strength fading, the words heavy on her tongue, each syllable a battle against the weight pressing on her mind, her soul. The creatures' screams were a deafening wail, their forms twisting, their claws reaching for her heart, their eyes boring into her soul, their whispers promising things she didn't want to hear, knowledge, power, oblivion. She felt her memories slipping, her childhood, her mother's voice, the reason she'd come to Vaeloria, all dissolving into the light, the mosaics pull a tide that threatened to drown her. But she held on, her voice a lifeline, her blood a chain. "Ego te lego, umbra aeterna." The light exploded, a wave of heat and force that knocked her back, her body slamming against the stone, the pain a distant echo compared to the fire in her mind. The creatures dissolved, their screams fading into silence, their forms sucked into the mosaic like water down a drain, their eyes dimming, their claws vanishing, their presence a fading echo in the air. The chamber was still, the symbols dimming, the air no longer thick with menace, the humming gone, replaced by a silence that felt like a held breath. Clara lay on the platform, her breath ragged, her hand bleeding, the pain a dull throb compared to the ache in her soul, the weight of what she'd seen, what she'd done. Elias knelt beside her, his face pale but alive, his arm dripping blood onto the stone, his spectacles crooked, his journal lying open beside him, its pages stained with dust and blood. "You did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with relief and fear. "The seal, it's holding." Clara pushed herself up, her body aching, her vision swimming, her scar burning as if it carried the weight of the ritual. "For how long?" she asked, her voice rough, her eyes fixed on the mosaic, its tiles cracked, the handprint gone, replaced by a faint scar in the stone, the symbols glowing faintly, like a dying ember, their light a reminder of the fragility of what they'd done. Elias didn't answer, his gaze following hers, his face haunted by the same question. The chamber felt different now, quieter, but the silence was heavy, as if the temple itself were watching, waiting, its stones holding secrets it wouldn't share. "We need to get out," Clara said, helping him to his feet, her own legs unsteady, her hands still bleeding, the pain grounding her against the disorientation of the ritual. They climbed the staircase, the air growing lighter with each step, though the scent of decay lingered, a reminder of the darkness they'd faced. The church was silent when they emerged, the shadows gone, the doors no longer sealed, their wood warm now, as if the church had exhaled its malice. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing a sky heavy with stars, their light cold and distant, their patterns unfamiliar, as if the world had shifted while they were below. But as they stepped into the square, Clara felt a chill, a whisper at the edge of her mind, faint but unmistakable, a voice that wasn't hers, "Demons don't need doors." She glanced at Elias, who clutched his journal, his face haunted, his eyes reflecting the same dread she felt, his spectacles fogged with the night's chill. "We sealed it," he said, his voice hollow, as if trying to convince himself, his words swallowed by the silence of the square. "It's over." Clara didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the church, its spire a dark finger against the sky, its silhouette a reminder of what lay beneath, its presence a weight on her soul. The air was still, but she felt it watching, waiting, a presence that hadn't been banished, only delayed. The seal was holding, for now. But some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The next morning, Vaeloria seemed almost ordinary, the fog retreated, the streets bustling with cautious life, the townsfolk moving through their routines with a wariness that betrayed their fear. Clara and Elias sat at a corner table in the inn, nursing weak coffee and bruised spirits, their hands trembling slightly as they gripped their cups. Elias's arm was bandaged, the wound shallow but painful, a reminder of the claws that had grazed him. His journal was open to a page of frantic notes scrawled in the night, the ink smudged, the pages stained with blood and dust. Clara's hand still throbbed, the burn from the mosaic a raw, red mark that pulsed with her heartbeat, a scar that felt alive, as if it carried the temple's secrets. "We need to know more," Clara said, her voice low, her eyes scanning the room for eavesdroppers, her senses heightened by the memory of the whispers. "The seal held, but it's temporary. Those things, the first ones, they're still there, waiting, and they're stronger than we thought." Elias adjusted his spectacles, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, his fingers trembling as he turned a page, his notes a labyrinth of fear and obsession. "My journal mentions a pact, centuries old, maybe older. The villagers bound something here, something they feared too much to name, something they called the First Ones. But the details are vague, Half the texts contradict each other, and the rest are in languages I can barely parse, fragments of Latin, old dialects, something that feels older. Then we talked to the locals, Clara said, her gaze settling on a woman in black sitting alone by the fire, her hands clutching a locket, her face pale as the ash in the hearth, her eyes distant, as if seeing something no one else could. Her name was Margot, a widow whose husband had vanished a year ago, one of the many who had entered the church and never returned, his absence a wound that festered in the town's heart. The townsfolk whispered about her, saying she heard voices, saw things in the dark, her sanity framed like the hem of her shawl, her grief a mirror to Vaeloria's own. Clara approached her, Elias trailing reluctantly, his journal tucked under his arm, his steps hesitant, as if the inn itself might turn against them. "Mind if we sit?" Clara asked, her tone gentle but firm, her eyes meeting Margot's with a steadiness that belied her own unease, her scar throbbing as if it sensed the widow's pain. Margot's eyes, pale and watery, flicked up, her fingers tightening on the locket, its silver tarnished, its surface etched with faint symbols that matched those in the church. "You're the ones who went into the church," she said, her voice a rasp, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, her words heavy with accusation. "You should have left it alone." "We're trying to understand," Clara said, sitting across from her, her hands folded to hide their trembling, her voice calm despite the weight of Margot's gaze. "What happened to your husband?" Margot's gaze drifted to the fire, her lips trembling, her fingers tracing the locket's edge as if it held her husband's soul. "He heard them. In the walls, in his dreams. Said they called his name, promised him things, knowledge, power, things no man should want, things that made him weep. One night, he went to the church. Said he had to see for himself, had to know what was calling him. Never came back." Elias leaned forward, his voice cautious, his spectacles slipping again, his journal open in his lap. "Did he say what they were? The things he heard?" Margot's eyes darted to him, sharp and wary, her voice low, as if afraid the fire might overhear. "Shadows. Old as the earth. They don't need doors, you know. They come through the cracks, the places you don't look, the places you can't see." Clara exchanged a glance with Elias, her heart sinking, the widow's words echoing the old woman's warning, the creature's taunts, the whispers that still lingered in her mind. "Did he leave anything behind?" she asked, her voice steady, though her scar burned hotter, as if it recognized the truth in Margot's words. "Notes, drawings, anything that might help us." Margot hesitated, her fingers tracing the locket symbols, then reached into her shawl and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and stained, its edges frayed as if it had been handled by trembling hands. "His journal," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes distant, as if seeing her husband's face in the fire. "I can't read it. The words, they move, they twist, they don't stay still." Elias took the book, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement, his scholar's curiosity warring with his dread. He opened it, revealing pages filled with erratic script, the ink smudged as if written in haste, interspersed with sketches of symbols, some matching those in the church, others unfamiliar, their shapes twisting in ways that hurt to look at, their lines seeming to writhe on the page. "This is remarkable," he muttered, his voice low, his fingers tracing the words as if they might burn him. "It's a record of the pact. Names, dates, rituals. But it's incomplete, like it was written by someone running out of time, someone who knew they were being watched." Clara leaned closer, her eyes scanning the pages, her scar throbbing as if it could read the symbols too. "Can you decipher it?" she asked, her voice urgent, her mind racing with the weight of what they'd found. "Not here," Elias said, closing the book with a snap, his gaze darting around the inn, his senses heightened by the memory of the creature's whispers. "We need time. And a safer place." Margot's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp despite its frailty, her fingers tightening on the locket. "There's no safe place in Vaeloria. Not anymore. Not since you stirred it up." Clara didn't argue, her mind already racing, the journal a lifeline but also a weight, its pages heavy with truths they weren't ready to face. She thanked Margot, her voice soft but firm, and led Elias back to their table, her step steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. They needed more clues, more voices, more pieces of Vaeloria's fractured past, a puzzle that grew darker with each fragment they uncovered. That afternoon, they visited the town schoolhouse, a crumbling building at the edge of Vaeloria, its walls sagging under the weight of time, its windows cracked, letting in drafts that carried the scent of damp earth and decay. They had heard of a girl, Anna, no older than 10, who drew strange symbols no one taught her sketches unsettling the townsfolk, their shapes echoing the ones in the church, the temple, the journal. The schoolmistress, a stern woman named Frau Heller, led them to a small room where Anna sat alone, sketching on a scrap of paper, her blonde hair tied in a loose braid, her eyes distant, as if seeing a world no one else could. Her drawings were nightmarish, spirals that seemed to twist off the page, eyes that stared without blinking, hands with too many fingers, their nails sharp as claws, their shapes alive with a malice that made Clara's skin prickle. She knelt beside Anna, her voice gentle, though her heart pounded, her scar burning as if it recognized the girl's drawings. "Hello, Anna. Can you tell me about your pictures?" Anna didn't look up, her pencil scratching relentlessly, its sound a counterpoint to the humming that still echoed in Clara's ears. "They tell me to draw them," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying a weight that made Clara's breath catch, a child's voice speaking truths no child should know. "The shadow people." Elias paled, his hand tightening on his journal, his spectacles slipping down his nose, his eyes wide with fear. "Shadow people?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his scholar's curiosity warring with the dread that gripped him. "Do they speak to you?" Anna nodded, her pencil never pausing, her movements mechanical, as if guided by something else. "They say the door's open. They're coming." Clara's heart sank, the words echoing the creature's taunts, the widow's warnings, the whispers that followed her into her dreams. She glanced at Elias, who was scribbling furiously, his hands shaking, his ink smudging as he tried to capture Anna's words. "Anna," she said, keeping her voice steady, though her scar burned hotter, "can we see your other drawings?" The girl pointed to a box under the table, her eyes never leaving her paper, her pencil scratching with a rhythm that matched the humming in Clara's ears. Clara pulled the box out, revealing dozens of sketches, each more disturbing than the last, their lines sharp and jagged, their shapes alive with a malice that seemed to pulse. One showed the church, its spire wreathed in black tendrils that seemed to writhe even on the page, their shapes curling inward like a trap. Another depicted a figure with no face, its mouth a gaping maw, its hands reaching out as if to pull the viewer in, its fingers too long, too sharp. A third showed the town square, but the cobblestones were cracked, oozing a black liquid that formed symbols Clara recognized all too well, their shapes burned into her memory, her scar throbbing as if it could feel them. "These are the same symbols," Elias whispered, his voice tight, his spectacles fogging again, his journal open to a page that mirrored Anna's drawings. "From the altar, the temple. She's drawing the seal." Clara's mind raced, the pieces falling into place, each one heavier than the last. The seal was weakening, and the first ones were reaching out, through dreams, through walls, through a child's pencil, their hunger a tide that threatened to drown Vaeloria. "We need to reinforce the seal," she said, her voice firm despite the dread coiling in her gut, her scar burning as if it agreed. "Before it's too late." Frau Heller, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward, her face pale, her hands trembling, her stern facade cracking under the weight of what she'd seen. "You should leave her alone," she said, her voice sharp but trembling, her eyes darting to Anna's drawings as if they might come alive. "She hasn't been right since her parents disappeared. The drawings, they scare the other children. They scare me." Clara met her gaze, unflinching, her scar throbbing, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. "We're trying to help. Not just Anna, but everyone in Vaeloria. If we don't stop this, no one will be safe." The schoolmistress didn't respond, her eyes holding a mix of fear and resignation, as if she knew the town was already lost, its fate sealed long before Clara and Elias arrived. Their next stop was the blacksmith's forge, where rumors spoke of a fire that burned without fuel, its flames casting shadows that moved on their own, their shapes twisting in ways that defied light. The blacksmith, a burly man named Victor, was hammering iron when they arrived, his forge glowing an unnatural red, the heat almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the humming in Clara's ears, her scar burning as if it recognized the fire's source. Sweat beaded on Victor's brow, but his eyes were hard, wary, as if he'd been expecting them, his hands steady on the hammer despite the fear in his gaze. "You're the one stirring trouble," Victor said, not looking up, his hammer striking the iron with a force that seemed to shake the ground, each blow a defiance of the darkness that clung to Vaeloria. "Heard you went into the church. Should have stayed out." "We're trying to stop trouble," Clara said, her voice steady, though the heat from the forge made her skin prickle, her scar throbbing hotter, as if it could feel the fire's malice. "Your forge, what's wrong with it?" Victor paused, his hammer hovering, his eyes flicking to the fire, its red glow casting shadows that danced on the walls, their shapes wrong, hands, eyes, mouths that moved when they shouldn't. "Started a year ago, after my brother vanished," he said, his voice low, his eyes distant, as if seeing his brother's face in the flames. "The fire doesn't die, doesn't need wood. Sometimes, it whispers." Elias stepped closer, wincing at the heat, his journal open in his hands, his spectacles reflecting the fire's glow. "Whispers what?" he asked, his voice cautious, his scholar's curiosity warring with the fear that gripped him. "Names," Victor said, his voice low, his eyes narrowing, as if the fire might hear him. "Mine. My brother's. Others. It knows things it shouldn't, things I never told anyone, things I buried deep." Clara noticed symbols etched into the forge's stone, faint but unmistakable, their shapes matching those in the church, the temple, Anna's drawings, the widow's journal. "These are the same as the church," she said, her voice tight, her scar burning as if it could read the symbols too. "They're everywhere." Victor's eyes darkened, his hammer lowering, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth was too much. "You think you can stop it? Whatever's in this town, it's older than us. Hungrier. It took my brother, and it'll take me if I don't keep this fire burning." Clara's heart pounded, the pieces falling into place, each one a weight that threatened to crush her. Vaeloria was a web, and the symbols were its threads, binding the town to something ancient, something that was waking, its hunger a tide that would drown them all. "We're going to try," she said, her voice firm, though doubt gnawed at her, her scar burning as if it knew the odds. "We have to." Victor snorted, a sound both bitter and resigned, his eyes flicking back to the fire. "Good luck, then. You'll need more than that. You'll need a miracle." That night, Clara and Elias pored over the journals, Elias's, the widow's husbands, and fragments they'd found hidden in the church's sacristy, tucked behind a loose stone, their pages brittle and stained, their ink faded but legible. The pages painted a grim picture. Centuries ago, Vaeloria's founders had faced a threat they couldn't name, a darkness that came with the land itself, its hunger a force that twisted the world around it. Desperate, they made a pact, offering blood to bind it, carving symbols into stone to hold it at bay, their lives the price of survival. The church was built to guard the seal, its priests tasked with renewing the ritual each generation, their blood a chain that held the darkness in check. But time and neglect had weakened the binding, and the first ones, the name whispered in the oldest texts, were slipping through, their hunger growing with each crack in the seal, their whispers reaching into the minds of the living. "We need another ritual," Elias said, his voice hoarse, his eyes bloodshot from hours of reading by candlelight, his spectacles smudged, his fingers stained with ink. The journals mention a second seal, deeper underground, beneath the town's oldest well. But it requires more than blood. Clara's jaw tightened, her hands still throbbing from the burn, her scar pulsing as if it could hear the words. "What does it require?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. Elias hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers, his fingers tracing the journal's pages, their edges frayed, their words heavy with truth. "A life," he said finally, his voice barely audible, his spectacles reflecting the candle's flicker. "One to bind, one to hold. A soul to anchor the seal." Clara stood, pacing the small room they'd rented at the inn, her boots thudding on the creaking floorboards, her mind a storm of fear and determination. "We're not sacrificing anyone," she said, her voice sharp, her scar burning as if it disagreed. "There has to be another way." Elias shook his head, his face pale, his spectacles slipping again. "The texts are clear. Blood strengthens the seal, but a life makes it permanent. The priests knew this. That's why they kept disappearing, why the church is empty now." Clara stopped, her eyes narrowing, her scar throbbing hotter. Then why didn't they stop? Why keep renewing a ritual that kills? "Because they had no choice," Elias said, his voice heavy, his eyes haunted by the weight of what he'd read. "The first ones don't sleep forever. If the seal breaks completely, Vaeloria won't be the only thing they take. They'll take everything." The weight of his words settled over her, heavy as the fog outside, a truth that pressed against her soul. She sat, her hands clenched, her scar burning, her mind racing for another solution, any solution, that didn't end in death. "We'll find another way," she said, though the words felt hollow, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, her scar throbbing as if it knew the truth. The town was unraveling, its threads fraying, its heart breaking. That night, screams echoed through the streets, sharp and desperate, cutting through the fog that had returned thicker than ever, its tendrils curling through windows, under doors, into dreams. Shadows moved in the mist, not just shapes but figures, their limbs too long, their movements too fluid, their eyes glowing with a malice that chilled the blood. Doors opened to nothing, their frames empty but cold, as if leading to a void that whispered names, promises, threats. Clara and Elias ran to the square, their breath visible in the chill air, their hearts pounding as they saw townsfolk fleeing, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror, their screams swallowed by the fog. Anna was gone. Frau Heller found her room empty, her drawings scattered on the floor, the symbols smeared with what looked like blood but smelled of something fouler, like rot and ash, a scent that clung to the air like a curse. Margot was found in her room at the inn, her locket clutched in her hand, her eyes staring at something no one else could see, her body cold despite the fire roaring beside her, its flames casting shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Victor's forge had exploded, the flames licking the sky, forming shapes that weren't human, hands, eyes, mouths that whispered names before fading into smoke, their words a litany of loss that echoed in the streets. Clara and Elias returned to the church, armed with the journals and a desperate plan, their steps heavy, their hearts heavier. The temple beneath was their only hope, but the air felt heavier now, the symbols brighter, their light pulsing with a rhythm that matched the humming in Clara's ears, her scar burning as if it could feel the darkness waking. They descended the staircase, the walls closing in, the air growing colder, the scent of decay stronger with each step, the symbols watching, their shapes twisting in ways that made her eyes ache. The chamber was different now, the sarcophagi cracked, their carved faces splintered, as if something inside had clawed its way out, their eyes glowing with a light that wasn't their own. The mosaic pulsed like a heartbeat, its tiles gleaming with an unnatural sheen, its spiral drawing the eye inward, toward a void that seemed to breathe. The creatures were waiting, their forms more solid, their eyes glowing with a malice that made Clara's skin crawl, their claws longer, their mouths wider, their presence a weight that pressed against her soul. Their leader stepped forward, its voice a chorus of screams, each word a blade in her mind, cutting deeper than her knife ever could. You cannot stop what is. The seal is ours. Clara stepped onto the platform, her hand bleeding from a fresh cut she'd made with her knife, the pain grounding her against the visions that threatened to overwhelm her, her scar burning as if it recognized the mosaic's power. Elias read from the journal, his voice trembling but unbroken, his spectacles glinting in the sickly light, his words a shield against the chaos. Ego te lego, umbra aeterna. The creatures lunged, their claws tearing at the air, their mouths gaping, their eyes burning with hunger, their whispers promising things she didn't want to hear, knowledge, power, oblivion. Clara chanted, her blood dripping onto the mosaic, the tiles burning her skin, the pain of fire that threatened to consume her. She saw visions, Vaeloria burning, its streets choked with shadows, the creatures spreading beyond the town, their hunger consuming the world, a tide that drowned everything in its path. She saw Anna, her eyes empty, her hands drawing symbols in the air, her voice a whisper in the dark, calling her name. She saw Margot, her locket open, revealing a mirror that reflected nothing but void, its surface a gateway to nowhere. She saw Victor, his forge blazing, his face twisted in agony as the flames took him, his screams a warning that echoed in her bones. Elias grabbed her, his own blood mixing with hers, his face pale but fierce, his hand steady on her shoulder, his spectacles reflecting the mosaic's light. We do this together, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, his eyes burning with a determination that matched her own. No one dies. They chanted in unison, their voices rising above the creature's screams, the chamber shaking, the sarcophagi crumbling into dust, their carved faces dissolving into ash. The light exploded, brighter than before, a wave of heat and force that burned Clara's eyes, her skin, her soul, a fire that consumed everything but left them standing. The creatures dissolved, their forms sucked into the mosaic, their screams echoing into silence, their eyes dimming, their claws vanishing, their presence a fading echo in the air. The mosaic cracked, its tiles splintering like broken glass, the symbols going dark, the air no longer thick with menace, the humming gone, replaced by a silence that felt like a held breath. Clara and Elias collapsed, their hands still joined, their blood pooling on the cracked mosaic, their breaths ragged in the silence, their bodies trembling from the weight of what they'd done. The seal was restored, the first ones bound, their hunger caged, for now. But the cost was heavy. Anna was gone, Margot dead, Victor missing, and others unaccounted for, their names a litany of loss whispered in the streets, their absence a wound that would never heal. They emerged into a dawn that felt wrong, the sky too clear, the air too still, as if Vaeloria were a painting, its colors too sharp, its edges too defined, its silence a lie. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces a mix of relief and resentment, their eyes accusing Clara and Elias of stirring a darkness they couldn't fully quell, their voices silent but their gazes heavy with blame. Clara's scar burned, a permanent reminder of the seal, its pain a constant companion, a mark that felt alive, as if it carried the temple's secrets. Elias clutched his journal, its pages heavier with new notes, his face haunted by what he'd seen, what he'd survived, his spectacles fogged with the morning chill. "We stopped it," Elias said, his voice hollow, his eyes distant, as if he could still hear the creature's screams. "But for how long?" Clara didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the church, its spire a dark silhouette against the sky, its presence a weight on her soul, its stones whispering secrets she couldn't hear. She felt the whisper again, faint but unmistakable, a voice that wasn't hers, "Demons don't need doors." The seal was holding, but the cracks were there, invisible but real, a fracture in the world that could never be fully mended, a wound that bled beneath the surface. They left Vaeloria that morning, their steps heavy, their hearts heavier, the road stretching into the fog, the town fading behind them like a dream they couldn't shake, its weight clinging to them like damp cloth. Clara's dreams were haunted, filled with symbols that moved, faces that screamed, hands that reached from the dark, their fingers cold and endless. Elias's journal grew thicker, his notes a labyrinth of fear and obsession, as if writing could cage the horror they'd faced, could hold back the darkness that still lingered in their minds. In the months that followed, they traveled, seeking answers in forgotten libraries, in the ramblings of madmen, in texts that crumbled at the touch, their pages brittle with age, their words heavy with truth. Elias pieced together more of Vaeloria's history, a tale of desperation and sacrifice, of a people who bound a darkness they couldn't name, their blood the price of survival, their lives the chain that held it in check. The first ones were not demons, not gods, but something older, something that existed before the world took shape, their hunger a force that carved the land itself, a tide that shaped the stones of Vaeloria. Clara's visions grew worse, the symbols following her into waking hours, their shapes flickering in mirrors, in the corners of her eyes, in the shadows that lingered too long. She saw Anna, her drawings alive, the shadow people reaching for her, their hands cold, their eyes empty. She saw Margot, her locket a void that swallowed light, its surface a gateway to nowhere. She saw Victor, his forge a gateway, his screams a warning that echoed in her bones, his face twisted in agony as the flames took him. The whisper was always there, soft but relentless, a reminder that the seal was a bandage on a wound that refused to heal, a chain with links that could break. They returned to Vaeloria after 3 months, drawn by a pull they couldn't explain, a compulsion that tugged at their souls, their steps heavier than ever, their hearts burdened by the knowledge of what they'd face. The town was quieter now, its streets emptier, its fog thicker, its air heavier with dread, as if Vaeloria itself were dying. The church stood silent, its spire ablaze against the sky, its doors open but unwelcoming, its stones whispering secrets that chilled the blood. They sought out Liesel, the hermit who lived in the woods, her hut a clutter of herbs, bones, and carvings that mirrored the symbols in the church, their shapes alive with a malice that seemed to pulse. Liesel was ancient, her eyes sharp despite her frail frame, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind, her presence a weight that pressed against Clara's scar. "You're back," she said, her gaze piercing Clara like a blade, her smile grim, her teeth yellowed and uneven. "You can't stay away, can you? The shadows call you back." Clara's scar burned, her voice steady despite the fear in her gut, her heart pounding as if it could feel the hermit's words. "We need to know. Is it over?" Liesel laughed, a sound like breaking glass, sharp and brittle, cutting through the silence of the hut. "Nothing's over. The first ones don't sleep forever. You delayed them, nothing more. Their hunger is older than time, and time is running out." Elias opened his journal, his hands steady now, his fear replaced by a quiet resolve, his spectacles reflecting the dim light of the hut. "There's another ritual," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on Liesel. "The journals mention a final binding, one that doesn't need blood, doesn't need a soul. But it's buried, hidden in the oldest texts, fragments we haven't found." Liesel's eyes narrowed, her fingers tracing a carving on her table, its shape a spiral that seemed to twist inward, drawing the eye into a void. "Find it, then," she said, her voice a rasp, her smile grim. "But know this, every binding has a price. And the first ones always collect." Clara and Elias spent weeks in Vaeloria, searching for the final ritual, their days filled with dust and shadow, their nights with whispers and fear, their dreams haunted by the symbols that followed them. They found fragments in the church's sacristy, hidden behind loose stones, their pages brittle, their ink faded but legible, their words heavy with a truth that chilled the blood. They found carvings in the town's oldest buildings, their shapes matching Anna's drawings, Margot's locket, the forge's stone, each one a piece of a puzzle that grew darker with each fragment they uncovered. They learned of a third temple, deeper than the second, hidden beneath the town cemetery, its entrance a crypt sealed with symbols that burned to the touch, their light pulsing with a rhythm that matched the humming in Clara's ears, her scar throbbing as if it could feel the temple's presence. The journal spoke of a ritual older than the pact, a binding that required no blood, no soul, but a will stronger than fear, a resolve that could withstand the first one's hunger, a strength that could hold back the tide. They descended into the crypt, their lanterns casting weak light against the slick stone, the air heavy with the scent of decay, the symbols watching, their shapes twisting in ways that made Clara's eyes ache, her scar burning hotter with each step. The chamber was vast, its walls carved with scenes of sacrifice, figures kneeling before eyeless beings, their hands raised in supplication, their faces twisted in fear, their bodies consumed by shadows that seemed to move. The mosaic at its center was black, its tiles a void that pulsed with an unnatural energy, its spiral drawing the eye inward, toward a darkness that breathed. The creatures were there, their forms faint but present, their eyes watching, their mouths silent but hungry, their presence a weight that pressed against Clara's soul, her scar burning as if it could feel their hunger. She and Elias stood together, their hands joined, their voices steady, their fear a fire that burned but didn't consume. Ego te lego, umbra aeternam, they chanted, their words a blade, their will a shield, their voices rising above the humming that filled the chamber, the symbols flaring brighter, the mosaic pulsing like a heartbeat. The creatures didn't attack, their forms fading, their eyes dimming, their hunger caged by a force stronger than blood, stronger than fear. The light faded, the mosaic cracked, the symbols went dark, the chamber silent, the air light, the weight lifted. Clara and Elias stood, their hands still joined, their breath steady, their scars a testament to what they'd done, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what it had cost. The seal was complete, the first ones bound, their hunger caged, for now. But the town had paid a price, Anna, Margot, Victor, and others, lost to the shadows, their names a litany of loss that echoed in the streets, their absence a wound that would never heal. They emerged into a dawn that felt different, the sky clear, the air light, the fog gone, but the silence heavy, as if Vaeloria were holding its breath, waiting for the next crack in the seal. The townsfolk didn't gather, didn't speak, their eyes no longer accusing but empty, as if the town itself had exhaled its last breath, its heart stilled by the weight of what had been done. Clara's scar was still, its pain gone, but its mark a reminder of the cost, a wound that carried the temple's secrets. Elias closed his journal, its pages full, its weight lighter, as if the words had finally found their place, their truth no longer a burden but a shield. "We did it," he said, his voice soft, his spectacles clear, his eyes free of fear, though the weight of what they'd seen lingered. "It's over." Clara didn't answer, her gaze on the road ahead, the church a fading shadow behind them, its spire no longer a threat but a reminder, its stones silent but watchful. The whisper was gone, the vision silent, but she knew the truth. The first ones were bound, but not gone, their hunger a tide that waited beneath the surface, patient and eternal. Vaeloria was a scar, and they had closed it, but some scars never fade, some doors never truly close. They walked into the dawn, their steps lighter, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the world was safe, for now. But the first ones were patient, and Clara knew, deep in her bones, that they would always be waiting, their whispers faint but never silent, their hunger a shadow that would never fade.